Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gwendolyn Reece, and this video is on understanding karma and how it can be used for its transformative effects. So thank you so much for joining me. For those of you who don't know me, I am a third-degree Wiccan high priestess with the Assembly of the Sacred Wheel, and my coven Theophania is located in Washington, D.C. I am also particularly devoted to the gods Apollo, and Athena, and serve them as priestess. I'm also a long-term Theosophist. And for those who don't know, Theosophy began in the late 19th century, and it was a movement that was bridging the Eastern religious traditions and the wisdom, the deep wisdom in many of the Eastern religious traditions, and putting them in conversation with the deep wisdom in the Western esoteric traditions. So when we talk about something like karma, as pagans, as Wiccans, as witches, often in our history, the way in which those discourses came together is through the Theosophical Society. And so my experience in studying Theosophy does deeply inform this particular lecture. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So karma, using its transformative powers. Every cause has its effect, every effect has its cause. Everything happens according to law. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. There are many planes of causation, but nothing escapes the law. And this is an aphorism that articulates one of the 7 Hermetic laws according to the text, the Kabbalion, which was initially written under the pseudonym of the 3 Initiates. And I find it to be a very useful text and recommend taking a look at it for quick aphorisms from many very deep kernels of wisdom that you can carry with you. And in this case, this is the relevant one for this talk. So, some quick caveat emptor, buyer beware. Gwendolyn, me? I am not an ascended master. I do not claim to be a fully enlightened being. What I claim to be is someone who has studied these things for quite some time and am sharing with you my understanding at this moment. I reserve the right for myself as a being who is still continuing to grow and evolve to change my mind. And I highly suggest that you always claim that right for yourselves as well. So in addition to the fact that I am not a fully enlightened being, karma is actually one of the most complex topics in existence. It is very, very challenging to really wrap your head around it in a deep way. And in fact, it arises in a number of the Indic religions, but even within kind of their source traditions, there is a great deal of disagreement about the specific nature of karma. So the intention of this video is not to persuade you, but I may ask you to accept certain things hypothetically so that you can gain an understanding of the topic, because any kind of deep philosophy requires, in order to have an understanding, that you accept certain fundamental propositions at the base of it. So let's move on. I want to talk quickly about how to assess occult doctrines, and this is my recommendation. Basically, there's a lot of different deep occult, meaning hidden or esoteric inner doctrines, or philosophies in general. And the first thing I would recommend is that try to understand it on its own terms. Try to get an understanding of it from its own perspective first, and then live with it for a while. Check it against your intuition, and if it rings true for you, then I advise you to apply it to your life and begin watching its effect on your consciousness and on your life. There is one of the occult sayings is all things work from the inside out. So the effect on your consciousness is something to pay very deep attention to. Does it bring you closer to your personal ideals, however those are constructed for you? For me, does it make me more kind, more loving, more tolerant, more wise? Does it give me a bigger perspective of reality? Does it give me a greater sense of purpose and ways to live my life as a responsible person in a more wise way with responsibility to the greater earth and so forth? But please remember that whenever you are dealing with any philosophy, any doctrine, anything, any idea that can make it into our human brains is not absolute. It's not the true ideal in like a Platonic sense. It is something that has had to pass through many different filters. And then by the time it can come out of someone's mouth into words and then be heard by someone else through words or read, those are all different filters. So you are beginning to have various, hopefully minor distortions, but it's not the absolute real truth ever by the time it hits a human mind. So the advice here is never hold any idea too tightly or get too rigid. Like I said, I highly recommend for you, as well as I claim for myself, the right to live and grow and change my mind. And I think that is something that we owe each other as evolving humans. So karma is part of kind of a number of philosophical traditions. Now, one of the things that is historically fascinating to me, as you may have gathered, I have a deep weddedness to the Hellenic, to the Greek traditions. I also actually have a deep weddedness to a number of the Indic traditions. Interestingly, philosophy first arises simultaneously but independently in Greece and in India, and nowhere else at that point. And most other places that develop what we would consider philosophy, we can trace it as kind of spreading and diffusion from those two places. But those are the places where it evolves at roughly the same time. I find that very interesting. But anyway, from an Hellenic perspective, what are the goals of philosophy? First, it is trying to understand what is the nature of reality. And the whole idea here is the nature of reality is a lot more complex than what it just seems to be on the surface. So what is it really? And then secondly, always accompanying that line of inquiry is, what are the implications for what we're finding for how to live a good human life? Because that should always be in the consideration as part of we as humans pursuing philosophy, philosophia, the love of wisdom, to become a lover of wisdom. So let's go into the definitions. What is karma? Now, karma is a Sanskrit word, and Sanskrit is one of the ancient Indian languages. And it's the language, for instance, in which the Vedas were written. Karma as a word, karma, it means action. And originally, it means efficacious ritual action. That's its original meaning. But pretty quickly, through the practice of philosophy, it extends to mean the relationship between cause and effect, which is why I started also with that aphorism from the Kabbalion. So it is the law of action, then, is the law of causation. And when we say law, we mean natural law, like gravity. We don't mean legal systems, and we don't mean any kind of anthropocentric moral law that governs human society, because all human laws are culturally contingent and they change over time. So we're talking about something that is really the natural law that relates cause and effect. So karma then, by being natural law, that is the relationship between cause and effect, is therefore the medium of continuity. And this makes it is what links all of these different things together. And so it is the through line ultimately of time. Here's what I can tell you. there are some big mysteries here that I personally have not fully unfolded in my own being and cannot really get it down to the level where I can articulate, but I can sense them in a really big way. And so I encourage you to meditate, and you might be faster than I am at like bringing that down so that it can really sit and unfold in the brain. But there's some mysteries here. So meditating on the nature of causation as continuity and the relationship between that and time. Like, could time even exist without causation? What is that? I love this stuff. So there you go. I've given you something that, you know, if you are like me, which maybe you're not, but if you are, this is amazingly juicy stuff. Okay, so there's some common ways of thinking about karma that you may have run into when people, you know, are talking about karma, and they talk about good parking karma and all sorts of stuff. So let's talk a little bit about that and kind of pull some of these out. A lot of the ways in which we talk about karma is very, very individualistic. We talk about like my karma, your karma, things like that. So that we tend to think of it in a very individualistic way. We also tend to think of it in terms of good karma and bad karma. Man, I've got really good parking karma. Yeah. Okay, so that's some of how we often think through it. It is typically linked with the idea of reincarnation in pretty much all of the theories. And a lot of times in which you hear people talking about it, they're talking about it in ways that are synonymous with justice, but in ways that are often delayed. So you'll hear about people, you know, thinking through, and they'll be like, talking about people who've done terrible things, and they'll be like, man, they're going to get theirs in this next life. And, you know, the other way of thinking about it that way is stuff like blaming your current misfortunes on a past life. And this often comes from people that have some anxiety issues where they're like, oh my God, what have I done? I must have done something really horrible for my checking account to constantly be in such a bad place. So, you know, both of these are kind of ways in which people tend to think about things. Sometimes you'll also find in various esoteric circles, somebody will talk about like the lords of karma. I shall report you to the lords of karma. And that's a translation of the Sanskrit Lipika. I have issues with the way in which that got translated into English, because it totally encourages people to go report people to the lords of karma, which doesn't actually exist like that. It's far more mechanistic, which we will get into. I mean, there are beings that you can call on if you have been done wrong, or if someone has broken an oath or so forth, but it's not exactly karma. Karma is far more like gravity. So I am going to invite you, therefore, to be thinking of karma in a far more mechanistic way. Think of it far more like gravity, rather than this kind of personalized lords of karma, somebody coming in and like, you know, making judgments and so forth. It's really much more just like, it's just cause and effect. That's really what it is. So think about it more mechanistically and non-anthropocentrically. Cause and effect runs through all creation. It's, if I am right that there's something there with time, like maybe it is a thing that even holds time together, it holds everything together. That is not an anthropocentric thing. Karma would exist if there were no humans at all, and it runs everything. So also I'm going to encourage us to be thinking of it very holistically, because part of the reality, like there's places where we have some delusion as humans, because we have our individuated consciousness. We tend to think very individually, but the truth is we are all enmeshed in very complex webs of relationship. And so we're really dealing with kind of a situation that is causation within webs of radical interdependence. However, when we are thinking about karma from an individual perspective, I would encourage us to also focus on the role of karma in the development of our character, as well as our external kind of environment and context. So let's go through some metaphysics, and we're going to take a swift crash through this, so hopefully it makes some sense to you. Metaphysics in 10 minutes or less, we hope. Okay, so Most esoteric and occult traditions, in fact, I don't know really of any that don't have this in some level, are utilizing a monistic and emanatory understanding of the nature of reality. So when you go to all of the world's mystics, and this is across traditions, across time, they tend to talk about something that we are going to call here the causeless cause, that everything in our differentiated world has as its root cause that is constantly there and that we are constantly a part of, even though we're not usually aware of it, is beyond space, it is beyond time, so it transcends both of those things, both of those, these are the Kantian a priori categories. It is transcending those. It is without attributes. It is something that transcends subject-object differentiation and therefore is ineffable. It is unspeakable because all of language presupposes all of these different things. So this idea that at the innermost, again, using language which is problematic, source of all is the causeless cause. And from this causeless cause, we begin the process, the way in which we get from that to here. There is a great mystery in that, but somehow we begin this process of what is sometimes called casting on the mantles of density. So we begin going from this one source that is neither being nor non-being into kind of a stepping down into manifested reality, in which we also begin to have differentiation. And it is probably for another video that I can go in a bit more detail about how this emanatory scheme is believed to come into existence, but there's a couple different things that I want to share here. First of all, we do have the causeless cause, and therefore everything else from there, it is all related. That is the initial cause, and everything else is an effect. But as you are stepping down, each one of those effects becomes a cause in its own right. So there is a sense of hierarchy that is natural here in terms of causation. There is also, therefore, a sense in which the denser is an effect and therefore not as directly causal as the less dense, if you want to put it that way, as we're thinking through this. And we'll get back to this idea in a minute. Another piece that is embedded within these types of theories is the idea that there are almost like cells in greater bodies. So there is an interdependent kind of web in which we make up larger organisms in very kind of interesting ways. So I want to take as a moment kind of our analogy here of looking at cells in body. Like if you think about your own body. So if I think about my own body, I can take my blood and I can scoop out some of it and put it in a petri dish. And those blood cells have their own kind of living reality. I mean, they're now separate from me, and as long as they are taken care of appropriately in a lab, they continue to have their own life that has nothing to do with this body anymore. They are clearly originally dependent upon this body, or they would not have been created and been able to have their own kind of thing, but they also clearly have kind of their own independent reality. So there's this kind of mystery there as well in terms of this relationship of, kind of dependence, but also kind of independence. At the same time, if you look at your body, I've taken some of those cells out. I maintain coherence. It has not hurt the coherence of this body. However, if you took all my cells out, then there isn't anything at all. So there's no body without these cells, and this body only experiences and grows through the experiences of those cells. And yet, at the same time, every 7 years, every single one of these cells is replaced. So there's this interesting kind of coherence of the greater whole that really is nothing but the cells, even though all the cells are constantly shifting and changing. And at the same time, there is this interesting independence of individual cells where they really do have kind of their own coherent identity. And so I'm saying this because I want us to get an understanding of the complexity of these types of relationships. So this is just, we're looking at our body at the moment. All right, think about that with an ecosystem. You've got a similar kind of set of relationships going on with an ecosystem. An ecosystem is made up of all sorts of lives. And you can take out certain individual ones, it will maintain its coherence. And they have their own kind of separate little existence. This bird over here is its own little bird, and yet at the same time, there's this. The ecosystems are made up of all the different parts. And if you have too much rupture in one, it starts to affect the life of the whole. Additionally, every ecosystem is part of a larger ecosystem. As part of a larger ecosystem, we are also part of our ecosystems. And eventually you end up with the life of the planet. And so in that way, we are cells. All these different parts are parts of the life of the planet. The planet itself is a part of the life of the solar system. And we would say in any of these esoteric situations that all of these lives, they have existence on all levels of being. So the planet, we're highly aware of its physical body. We're moving around in it, walking and so forth, but it also has an emotional body. It also has a mind, and we are participating. It also has spirit and soul. We are participating in all of this as cells. And in fact, one of the definitions of a human being that I particularly like, and I'm going to cite my beloved Theosophical elder, Julia Rogers, for this, is that a human being is any being in any time and any place wearing any body in which highest spirit and lowest matter are joined at the plane of mind, because that's where our primary growth action is. It's in the mind. And therefore we are part of, thankfully not all of, but part of the mind of the planet is a large portion of the function of human beings within this greater life. Anyway, lots and lots of fast metaphysics here, probably not as fast as it should be. Moving on. So what we are dealing with here is that we are dealing with very complex systems of dramatic interdependence. That is reality. Everything is in this very complex web where it is related to everything else. And I'm going to steal dangerously, because I am not a physicist, I'm going to steal dangerously from physics and say, this seems to me that we're talking about something that begins coming closer to chaos theory. In terms of we're not dealing with closed systems in which you can say, here is cause X, and it produces cause Y, because everything around these is involved in all sorts of other very intricate relationships that spill out in webs. So you can't have anything that is that clear as far as causation goes. And part of what that means, so our systems are open and dissipative. And part of what this means is that they are highly sensitive to initial conditions, that there are various structures that you begin seeing, like self-amplifying feedback loops, and we're going to go a little bit more into that, and that everything is embedded in constantly shifting relationships and is changing itself. So it's really complex. That's why I said karma is super complex. But all of this seems to me to begin getting closer to more of a Buddhist understanding of the nature of causation. Again, we can go into a different workshop maybe about some of those ideas at some point. But yes, we are not in a closed system. It's very, very complex. Everything is relationships. So I want to talk quickly here. I've given you some Sanskrit in terms of the way in which the Theosophical Society names the different planes of reality as we're talking about this kind of casting on of the mantles of density. And actually, what they are is not as important as, in many ways, we could call this a heuristic diagram. For those who are not as embedded into philosophy, heuristic basically means like, this is useful. We're not making a claim that this is absolutely 100% the true ideal form that exists in reality, but it represents something and is a useful way of laying it out. So there's pieces of this that I'm going to say are heuristic, such as the names and where we divide certain things up, but there's other parts of it that I'm going to say are real. In terms of like, these are the pieces that are absolutely just the way things are. So basically, what you have here that I believe is real is if we think about this as a range of vibration, we have from the very highest range of vibration, which would be that causeless cause, descending down into this casting on of the mantles of density until we get down to the place where we are in the densest. And that all of these things are a range. So it's a range of vibrations. That part, I believe, is real. How we specifically divide some of those things up and what we call them, that's probably heuristic. You know, whether or not there are, you know, an 8-note scale. If you're in flamenco, you can, like, each note that I would hear is a single note. They're like, oh no, there are like 17 notes in there. So, you know, but there is a range of vibration. The other thing here, and also that humans exist on all those. That's the other part. We go from the highest down to the densest. There are beings that are, you know, spirit beings that don't come all the way down to the densest, as an example. Okay, so we have all these. The other thing that I think is not heuristic is if you see here, like, let's take the one that says Buddhi, and we see that same color in all of these different kind of areas. It's this idea that there are scales. So it's like there's these patterns of vibration, but there's also areas of sympathetic resonance, that there are kind of scales. And so when you are in, say, the physical, there is an aspect of the physical that has sympathetic resonance with that sixth plane, as in this Buddhi. And it's like if you go to a piano and you hit a middle C really, really hard, all the other C strings will vibrate, you know, in the different octaves. So this idea that there are basically octaves and that sympathetic resonance is a real thing, that's the other piece here. So this is kind of one of the maps in terms of like these different levels of vibration. They go throughout all of reality. We have our parts. We are operating in all of them. And that is a quick map of how this works. Now, I'm talking about this because as we're trying to understand causation, when we look at this, those higher vibrations, which, you know, when we talked about the emanatory scheme, they are causal to the lower vibrations. So they have a dominant causal influence over the lower. And these are in those more subtle aspects of reality. As a human being, I'm going to go back here for a second. Okay, so as a human being, when we are born, we come in and we spend the first 7 years trying to get like our body and our basic emotions online and get mastery of them. And then as we get older, we start working more with some of our mind. And then hopefully we start working with some of our abstract mind and getting some mastery. And then, as you know, as we get like the abstract mind having some mastery, we have more ability to actually control, not in a bad way, but in a good way, have like control over our emotions so that our emotions become a vehicle for our higher ideas to kind of flow through, and that our desires are being driven by our touching higher things, like, you know, as opposed to just being driven by whatever stimulation is going on around us. And then maybe if we start following a really serious spiritual path, we'll begin to awaken on those levels, at which point then our intuitions from those levels can begin to filter through and use, if we have developed it well, our well-organized mind. So we're able to take these spiritual impulses and turn them into thoughts that are reasonable, that we can then, you know, begin to pull them back down and act on them in the world. So this is kind of this idea that we're like opening up on these levels, trying to get mastery. And then as we do, then we are able to utilize them, and they are naturally causally dominant. But it's also harder to really awaken and to master these upper kinds of vibrations. So, you know, for most human beings, our work is in mind. That's where our work is. And the ability to really begin to do abstract thinking and then from there into high spiritual intuition, that's not easy stuff. So it's hard to like be really positive and active there. But if we can be, those are naturally causal, not just on our own lower vehicles, but on everything that is operating in that lower plane of existence. So that is to say, higher vibrations are causal to lower vibrations, but they're harder for us to work with. That idea of sympathetic resonance is therefore very important, because sometimes if we want to do something that would require us to be really active on a higher plane than we're really fully have mastery over, we can utilize sympathetic resonance by finding the octave below and working there and trying to therefore, you know, vibrate that higher note as well. So to be effective, though, you have to take into account, if you're working with this idea of causation, existing lines of force. You're not walking into something, you know, that doesn't already have a bunch of causes in effect. So you want to try to have an understanding, do some analysis of what are the current kinds of causes and the current contexts in which you're working, because you're not working in a vacuum. Okay. Now, magic then is directly related to this. Those of you who are magical practitioners have probably picked up on some of this. Magic is largely about manipulating probability based on introducing new causes by operating in some of those more subtle vibrations, so some of those higher vibratory areas. It's a large part of what magic actually is. And I'm saying here probability because we're not in closed systems. You're not walking into a blank slate, contextless situation in which you can just be like, I will now do this and it will have this particular outcome, because nobody's living like that. You know, you are embedded in context. You're embedded within your own context, whatever it is that you're doing. There's already active causes around it. But the hope is that if you do some decent analysis and can do some effective work utilizing the higher vibration and therefore more causally potent realms of reality, then you can have more of an effect. So magicians, a large part of their work is to train to become awake on those higher levels and active at those higher vibrations that are more causal. And then, as I mentioned before, that idea of sympathetic resonance, sympathetic magic is using that sympathetic resonance to activate higher vibrations. So, you know, finding some of those, and a lot of times when we're doing our magic, we're trying to do all of it. We're just trying to do all of it, which is, you know, an effective strategy a lot of times, where you're like, I'm going to burn this candle and work with this herb and, you know, try to touch the emotional level in this way and, you know, call on the deities that are associated that I know are active on this particular level of vibration that are in alignment, and therefore try to get this cause moving, as well as trying to polarize myself up as high as I possibly can. So, I mean, you know, we're often pulling all these things together, but that's kind of how we're working with this. So trying to go up into the more causally potent areas, trying to, you know, hit those sympathetic vibration notes. But all of this requires some really kind of sophisticated analysis of the situation previously, the context in which things are embedded. And it's never going to be perfect. Don't let perfection become the enemy of the good. That was kind of preachy, but still, it is a danger. Okay, so I want to go a little bit through what karma is not. As I have been saying, karma is not anthropocentric. It is not just about us. I have found certain people are very resistant to the idea of karma because they feel as though it is passing judgment upon them. And it's like gravity. It's not that. That's not what's going on there, in my opinion. I also just don't think it's the law of retribution. You know, this is how it is sometimes framed, including in some of the Indic traditions. And I don't think that's a correct understanding. So, and the reason I say that is because justice and fairness are human concepts. And karma is just not anthropocentric. Nature doesn't care about our ideas of justice and fairness. It just doesn't. Those are human things. And our concepts of justice and fairness are culturally contingent, and they change over time. But I think that the sense that there is such a thing as fairness, and the idea of feeling wronged if things feel unfair, I think that's universal. So I think that the quest, or the duty, really, the human responsibility to create just societies, I think that is our work. So people who are like, karma will take care of it, as though karma is going to make our societies just or fair, I don't think they are. I think that's our work. And so at the same time, there are karmic consequences to having an unfair society, because that is causal and it creates all sorts of effects. But again, I think that, it's not karma is not justice. Justice is human, and we need to take up the work of creating justice in our relationships with ourselves and with those with whom we share the greater earth. There's also the old myth of good and bad karma. By myth, I really kind of mean sacred narrative. I mean, that's really what myth means, right? So this is kind of one of those things. The sacred narrative is what you don't question, that structures your idea of reality to the point where you don't even realize that you have it as part of your structure. So usually when people talk about good or bad karma, they really are talking about things that feel pleasant or unpleasant. And there's a danger in thinking that way, in that, first of all, good karma, things that feel pleasant, they can also be traps for complacency and keep you from growing, which I think is our work as humans. Secondly, the idea of bad karma, that can get you into the place where bad things happen, and instead of doing analysis on them and finding the messages and opportunities in there to assist your growth, you're just like, man, I must have been a horrible person in my last incarnation. I can't believe what's happening to me. So I think it can, again, get in the way of our growth. So let's talk a little bit more about individual karma. First of all, I do want to quickly talk about the relationship here to the macrocosm. So collectively, as I had mentioned earlier, it is my belief that humans are part of the mind of the planet. And if you ever have heard the phrase, we are children of the imperfect gods, what that means is that we ourselves, in this greater being that is the earth, which is in many ways our closest God, because we are cells and this is where we live and move and have our being. It is also evolving. The consciousness, the being that is this planet is evolving. It is also growing and changing. And if we take seriously this idea, which I do, and I invite you to at least consider it, that humans are cells in the greater body, and that because we are most active in terms of what we're trying to grow and unfold in mind, wow, that means we are part of the mind of the planet. And that means, in the words of many of us are familiar with, is the planet ever going through some heavy duty shadow work, man? And so, if you understand it that way, then part of what that means is that when we take on into ourselves our own work, like our own shadow work, our own trying to look at the things that are in our way that are not the way in which we want them to be, or the parts of ourselves that we are not claiming because they don't meet our expectations, all these different things that we're doing are really the intense, deep inner work that should be part of an occult or esoteric path. Whenever we're doing that, we are part of the mind of the planet doing it, and it has real effects on the whole. So every time I look at myself and I look in my own heart and I see something that I'm like, I want to be better than that. I don't want the unkindness that I see here. I want to be better than that. I'm going to work on this. I am kind of part of the mind of God saying that. So this is how the planet evolves, through each of the experiences of all of the cells that make it up. And like I said, human beings, thankfully, I don't think we're all of the mind of the planet, but we are a significant part. And we got a lot of work to do. So again, the evolving planetary consciousness. So what does evolve? Well, there's continuity of personality. And when I say continuity, what I mean is this. Again, we are subject to initial conditions. So who I am now, I am not the same person I was when I was 13, which is a good thing if you knew me then. Huh. So I'm not the same person I was. But at the same time, the person I am developed from the person I was. So a large part of those experiences, they shaped who I am, who I will be, by the end of this life. Probably not the same person I am right now. Who I am in several incarnations won't be the same, but it will be related. There is a trajectory of growth and experience. Similarly, there's a continuity of relationships. So we are embedded in our context. We have various relationships. The closer our bonds and our connection with people, for good or bad, and by that I do mean pleasant, unpleasant, but also whether or not it is building our growth or in the way of our growth, those also continue and develop. Now, I am going to say, because this is one of the big things that gets a lot of people resistant, which is, a lot of people have some experiences. In fact, I'm going to say virtually everyone I know has at least one relationship that would be considered abusive. And the question there is, what do you do with those? And first of all, there are people that wrap around the axle like, did I deserve this? And there are people like, screw karma, man. I didn't deserve this, which again, karma is just cause and effect. So that's not what it's about. But the point is, if what you need to do is rupture a relationship and end it, what you got to strive for is neutrality. And we're going to get into a little bit about that because any deep connection, positive or negative, if it's intense, that continues that cord. So what you really want to do if you have abusive relationships, you got to make a decision about whether or not it's something that you are going to try to heal, or if you are going to try to be like, and let us close this, which is an appropriate action in many, many cases. So I just want to mention that. But what this does also mean is that the self and our relationship with others are constantly evolving. And then the hopeful thing in that is that when you have those connections of love, that those don't end either. They continue to develop and evolve and change. They're never the same, but there is a continuity. Okay, so karma operates on an individual level in two different domains. It helps you builds character, like the character of who you are. And then it also creates context in the environment. So in order to understand this, we need to think a little bit about thought forms and how they work. And in order to understand thought forms, you got to understand a little bit about elementals and what they are. Okay, so this is another graph that kind of is just trying to represent sort of how some things work. So how we were talking about how there's this casting on of the mantles of density from highest spirit down to lowest matter. Okay, so all of this is actually happening through, if we want to talk about it as life waves, this constant pouring out. And so as they are pouring out, there's what in the Theosophical Society we call the involutionary arc, and then the evolutionary arc. Now, the truth is, if you're really talking about things growing and, changing in that way, then it's all evolution. But for the purposes of trying to make a little bit of sense of this, I think the Theosophical Society tends to use this language. And to me, it's a little helpful. So on the way in, this is these life waves that are coming down and this casting on of the mantles of density. So they're coming down through all those levels of vibration, but in the elementals, in this kind of, way in which they're coming down, they don't have self-awareness. They don't have self-consciousness. This is those kind of initial outpourings, and they don't have that yet because they haven't gotten to that point of development. But they are on, like I said, there's different levels as they are pouring down from this very subtle. There's ones at elemental 1. Those are very, very, very high vibration, but they don't have self-consciousness. When you encounter an elemental at some of those levels, you might think initially that you're dealing with a god, that you're dealing with a high archangel or whatever, but they don't have self-consciousness. Very high spiritual, but the very high spiritual of a brand new spirit baby almost. So, incredibly potent, but they don't have self-consciousness. All the way down into the ones that are basically right above the physical. So elementals coming down. Then when they finally, these life waves, they hit the mineral. This is where, so what they're doing, sorry, I should have said this, as they're coming down, what their job is, what they're learning is how to hold form. So the ones at the very high level, holding form is really tough at that level. It's, you know, it's very tenuous. As you get down further and further and further towards the physical, it becomes easier and easier to really get a good stable form. And then when these life waves finally actually are born into the mineral kingdom, into the physical kingdom, and that's like all of the physical stuff. It's like being, you know, any of the cellular structures, like our body is made up of tons of these things, like all of the atoms and stuff. But what it's really good, what it's really doing there is like, I now have form at the highest being. And then you start to have in the vegetable kingdom, things begin to respond to environment, and they become more complex conglomerates of all these different little lives. Animal kingdom, human kingdom. You know, the animal kingdom, by the way, is like really, really working on mastering emotions. And you can see, like, from the vegetable kingdom, it's everything from a plankton up to the sequoias. So, you know, there's a huge gradation of development that's there. And same thing in the animals, everything from like an earthworm up to a seeing eye dog who can do math possibly better than me. So, you know, you have this huge range. And then when you hit humans, are real, and like at the top of the animal kingdom, they're really working with mind too. They're really starting to do that. And then with humans, we're working with mind, and we're trying to birth into abstract mind and eventually into buddhi, into the spiritual awakening. And then when we are active enough on those levels and have perfected things, then that's when we graduate from the human kingdom. Okay, so that's kind of like a quick swirl through some evolution here. So the reason we have to do that, thought forms. Okay. The elementals that operate at all levels of vibration until they reach the physical as a mineral, and they're learning how to hold form, and they're playing. But so when you come in contact with a thinking being, like a human, we're not the only ones, but we're really big ones who think a lot. So when one of us has a thought, we are creating on the level of vibration, wherever that is, we're creating a thought, you know, and that can be in almost any of those ranges of vibration. We tend towards having most of our thoughts around the place where emotion is mixed with cognition. That's usually where the action is for humans. But sometimes we have really abstract thoughts. Sometimes we have thoughts that are barely thoughts at all and are almost all just sensation. But at whatever level we're having a thought, there is an elemental that is at that level of vibration that is going to be attracted to the kind of mold that we've created and give it form. And so as we're creating this and we have, you know, this kind of form, elementals are the plastic essence, and they're pouring themselves into the molds of thought that we are creating. And this is one of the reasons why human beings are so freaking powerful. We don't know our own power because we are constantly creating thoughts. And then these elementals are coming to them, and they are learning about how to hold form by holding the form of our thoughts. So most of our thoughts, most thoughts of any human, including really advanced humans, are pretty ill-formed and pretty transient. They're just like random things. And so it's almost like, you know, these wispy kinds of coming in to almost form for a minute before it just dissipates. But some of our thoughts are more clearly formed and are more stable. And this can be for good or for bad. Okay. So basically, when we're talking about thought forms and character, repeated thoughts have more stability and they're more easily recreated. You know, if you have a thought that you have a lot, then that kind of becomes really easy to just go there. The elementals are kind of like totally ready, and you know, it becomes more and more crisp and clear over time. And so it is more easy for your mind to go there. And when your mind goes there, it's more easy for the elementals to really kind of hold that form. It is in the nature of mind to loop on things. This is part of, at least of human mind, this is part of our pattern. We have a propensity to loop on things, and that's just within the structure and the nature of mind. So these repeated thoughts tend to have more stability, they're more easily recreated. And also, if you have similar thoughts, they kind of tend to, the elementals tend to kind of come together and build these kind of conglomerates, which makes them even stronger. So this creates a sort of self-amplifying feedback loop, because if it's holding more structure, then you're kind of encountering it in the level of sensation that is also at whatever vibratory level that is, which makes you have that thought again. So these can really build. And anyone who has ever dealt with troubling thoughts, troubling negative thoughts, these like tapes that we, sometimes play, knows about this self-amplification and how that starts to spin out and become a bigger and bigger part of your mental field and your emotional field. So that's the downside. The thing here is that attention feeds and attention starves. But it's very difficult to not think of a thought. You can't be like, oh, I'm not going to think about whatever this is right now. Like, if you were trying to kick an addiction, like stop smoking or something, I'm not going to think about a cigarette does not help because you just thought about a cigarette. So it can like really be challenging to break these. And like I said, the more you have this, the more it makes up your field of consciousness. So the issue here is the habitual mental patterns and thoughts. They tend to like almost form grooves in the mind, if you want to think about it that way. They're like forming these grooves, almost like, like cutting a bed of a river. Like it starts small, but then it gets deeper and deeper. And then what happens is when you are not willfully paying attention, and, we all have a limited amount of will, then what happens is that your thoughts just more easily run down those grooves without intentionality. So the issue here is that this, much like mental plasticity, brain plasticity, man, it is dangerous for us in certain ways because Facebook can reprogram your mind, but it's good because we can reprogram our mind back away from it. So, in this case, it's like, it's neutral. It's like gravity. It's, this is cause and effect. We can use it. So one of the first things here is be aware of your repeated thoughts. Just create a practice for yourself in which you are becoming aware of your repeated thoughts. So one of the things that I have worked hard on training myself to do, and I'm not going to say I do it perfectly, but I do it relatively well, is noticing when I have the same thought 3 times in a row. And when I do, going, wait, hold on. And then I take a look at that thought and I was like, is this a thought I want? And if it is a thought that I want, groovy, let's do it again. But if it's not, I neutralize that, I draw a white X through it, and I replace it with something else. I replace it. So it's a matter of creating these alternative thoughts that you want to have. And when you have something that you don't want to have, having another thought like crystal clear at the ready that you can repeat. And what you do is you don't dwell on the thought you didn't want to have. So you cultivate then repeated thoughts. And this is a really useful, a really easy way to do this is to use mantras or affirmations to rate various things. So, having either a mantra, part of a mantra practice that you do, or having some affirmations that you've created that help you build the thoughts and the character that you want. So, for example, I am Apollone's apprentice. I mean, that's how I understand my spiritual path. There's a lot of depth behind that is personal that I can unpack, but I am Apollone's apprentice. Mala, 108 times, I am Apollone's apprentice. 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 I also have some devotional mantras that I do, Apollon Pythios, Apollon Delphinios, Eopaions, things like that. And what that means is the more that you do that, and it's a lot of repetitions, the point of doing a lot of repetitions is so that in those moments in which you're like, and not thinking for a second, that rather than having your mind just kind of start going off into like, I hate my job, I hate my job, I hate my job, which is a really common one. Instead, it goes, I am Apollon's apprentice, I am Apollon's apprentice, I am Apollon's apprentice, I am Apollon's apprentice, or whatever it is that is deeply meaningful for you. Or like I said, a mantra, it's part of mantra practice. Anyway, that is, but having some of these things at the ready, and if you have anything that you're really trying to change, like, you know, if you are trying to break a bad habit like smoking, one of my friends and colleagues had used this one, you know, I live a healthy lifestyle, I live a healthy lifestyle, I live a healthy lifestyle, and was just doing that a whole lot. And therefore, you know, having something that is directly counter that you want to replace is also a very useful thing. Okay. So another piece here is to build your aspirations into clear pictures, into something that you can really clearly wrap your mind around and be able to call up and draw and hold elementals that can give it clear pictures and therefore make it a more stable part of your mental field. Like I said, intentionally building and using habit. Habit is everything. Habit is everything, man. And you don't break habits, you replace habits. So a large part of magic is intentionally constructing and feeding thought forms. So again, this kind of goes along with this, is create the thought forms for the life that you want. And then you have to, it's not enough to just like, I've done this ritual once and it is amazing. It's like building it up and feeding it. Like that might create the thought form, but you gotta feed it if you want it to maintain. So creating some sort of repetitive pattern that does that. So let's move on to karma and the environment. So the environment is made by actions, and there is no action that is not preceded by thought and desire. So basically then having intentional created desires tends to create opportunities for action. So consciously cultivating your desires is a very good piece of this. It's also important to note that there are many times in which we're part of larger webs and contexts. And, you know, sometimes like, even if you're able to operate at a really high spiritual level, if you are embedded in a huge context with tons of really potent causes already going, you may not be able to do what you want to do. You may have a really kind of difficult context that you can't shift. And, you know, sometimes it's not about us. And I think that's part of the thing. It's like, you know, there are circumstances that are just not about us. I mean, we're part of a larger context and they affect us, but we can't get out of them. And, you know, that doesn't mean it's your individual karma. So for example, you know, there are times in which we might be part of an environmental degradation situation. And maybe an individual would have a strong enough karmic cause in play that they get some sort of, you know, reprieve and don't have the tree fall directly on them or on their house. But sometimes just not, you know, unless they really have something very specific there, they're in a situation in which we're in environmental degradation. And as part of the whole, as cells in the larger whole, we are subject to the causes and conditions for all of it. I do also want to point out that there, you know, this interplay between character and environment is kind of interesting in that, like, there's no such thing as wasted effort. I think this is one of the things that at least gives me hope. I don't believe in this kind of a system that there is such a thing as wasted effort. You may not get the result that you were hoping for, but at the same time, there's no such thing as wasted effort. So if I go out there, and anyone who knows me knows that I do this, if I go out there and I'm like, I am going to do the biggest magic I can possibly do to try to protect our democracy, and I'm going to get a bunch of other, powerful witches, and we're going to do the best magic that we can do to protect our democracy. I may not be able to overturn millions of people trying to annihilate our democracy. But at the same time, I do believe that I am having some impact because I am a cell in the greater being, and I am able to operate at higher causal levels than, most people who don't do the kind of work that we do. So, I am having some impact. And then the other thing is, regardless of whether or not I actually succeeded in having any other impact, I am generating positive developments in my own character. And as I am a cell in the mind of the planet, that also is worth something, and may be worth way more than any of us have any ability to see directly. I think it probably is. Okay. Earth school. This is one of the ways in which I tend to think. So I believe that all of us are in Earth school. So throughout our entire evolutionary process, we're learning, we're growing, and I would highly recommend trying to cultivate this mindset, because what it means is that you tend to approach life looking for potential lessons. And I think that is valuable. And it also, it can give you some resilience in really difficult times. The other thing that it does is that when I was saying, about the kind of myth of bad karma and how that can be really problematic and get in the way of your growth, painful circumstances, what they're often doing is highlighting a lack of a particular skill or knowledge. So, for example, there are an awful lot of people in this world that have a rough time with money. And first of all, we are embedded in an overall social system that is built on dramatic inequities, and we are part of a context that is not fair, and that is a human problem, and collectively we need to fix it. In addition to that, though, I'm going to say, if you look at the course of human history and you think about reincarnation, and I am taking that as a presumption, and if you don't believe in reincarnation, then just take this as an interesting idea. But if reincarnation is true, there's an awful lot of us, an awful lot of humanity who has limited to no experience with money until this incarnation or until the last couple. I mean, most of human society for most of the time was based on the barter system, unless you were super wealthy. So it's not surprising to me that there's a lot of people who just have some lack of skill and knowledge here. And then we don't do a great job teaching it either in our socialization. We don't tend to do a good job of teaching personal finance. So the danger of looking at something and being like, man, I'm broke again, I must have really bad karma, is that you don't look at it and go, man, I'm broke again. What are the lessons I need to know? Like, how can I redress this? What are the deficiencies that this is highlighting for me so that I can stop doing that? I mean, and I do think it's like paying attention to where are you being given a lot of growth opportunities that are repetitive, and go figure that out. So anyway, that's part of it. And, maybe you look at it and the issue isn't that you don't have a lack of money. The issue is that you're just not good at setting boundaries with people who are going to take advantage of you. I mean, like, what are the lessons, the deficiencies, and the competencies that you need to build? Also, as you are doing these different things, I would say, set for yourself some stretch goals. You want to put yourself into positions in which you are pushing past where it's comfortable, not enough to the point where you're going to like dramatically injure yourself, but something a little bit beyond what you think that you can do at this moment. So again, reincarnation, we have the continuity of character, we have the continuity of relationships. And I would say, again, there's no such thing as wasted effort. Any effort that you put into improving yourself or improving your relationships with people, even if that improvement is to cease having a relationship with a particular person, all of that is something that continues onward and is well worth your effort. There's also an issue of group karma. So as I said, we're all in these very interdependent webs. And this notion that we have relationships and there's continuity of relationships, part of what that means is that we often will kind of reincarnate with and be back in relationship with people with whom we have bonds. So it is my belief, by the way, and this is my belief, that we have free will about many different things, but it's also in context. So there's your individual free will is mitigated. Let's say it that way. It's mitigated because you're embedded in an awful lot of context. So there are times in which you might have free will to do certain kinds of things, but then you're stepping into the Mississippi River and it's going to carry you. So, there's kind of like an interesting issue there with some free will. The biggest place that I see this is I am not entirely sure how much free will you have over becoming parents to certain souls. I don't know. I mean, and this is something that I look at and I wonder about, because those relationships are really interesting. There's an awful lot of people who seem to get together that maybe are not great life mates, but clearly needed to be together because of some karmic relationship with the being for whom they are supposed to be parents. And I will also say, one of my old friends and mentors used to tell me, she used to say, Gwen, the hardest karmic relationships you will ever have are going to be in your families, because those are the ones that you would not choose of your own free will. And I don't know what to think about all of that, but I think it's an interesting idea and maybe worth considering. Regardless, there's also, since we're cells in these larger beings, there are these group consciousness that we end up with that are kind of made up of us, that they're evolving through the experience of all these different cells, but they also have kind of their own sort of thing going on. You'll see this sometimes in nations and in large groups. You can work magically with very large groups, including nations, by kind of treating them like a person, doing some of the magic and creating it like you're dealing with a particular entity, because they kind of have that. Kind of interesting. There's also, group souls that are on various initiatory paths. So people that are bonded together for particular types of the greater work, who tend to reincarnate in relationship with each other and evolve together. So again, when we're looking at changing karma, you want to understand the level of causation. So you want to think about that, idea of where is it on the vibratory plane. And then you can also use the law of polarity. So you can use the law of polarity to move up and down within kind of the vibratory ranges. But the other thing is, when you're looking at a particular situation, you might want to see whether or not there is a polarity that it's kind of sitting on, something that you don't, that you want to see different. And what I mean by that is, there's the idea that polarity is like and unlike are the same, but they're different in degree. So you're dealing with something, it's like the pairs of opposites. If it's really a polarity, it's really one kind of thing that is different in degree. So hot and cold, what you're really dealing with there is temperature, right? And the way in which you can change it. So this is anytime when you can see one of these and find a polarity, is that you begin applying pressure at the opposite pole. So if something is too hot, you start applying coolness to it and you drag it. So, that's something that you can also begin doing. So looking for places in which you can do transformative action like that and introduce new causes. Also, for the character part, scrutinize your character and then practice those mental and moral qualities. Basically, any of the virtues can be learned and developed. And for me, and I'll do another lecture on this at some point, the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, I think, is one of the most useful to me, almost like manuals of how to do this building of character, building of ariti, of virtue, of excellence. you can work to enlarge your capacities and identify weaknesses and work to strengthen them. Again, look at where you're having pain. Look at the learning opportunities that you were given over and over again. And then instead of just feeling badly about them, which is how most of us tend to react at first, take a look and see, what do I need to strengthen? What capacities do I need to build? What are my deficiencies? What don't I understand that I need to grow with? And, then the other big thing here is you become what you meditate on. You become those repetitive thoughts, whatever those are. So watch also what you feed your mind. And I'm going to say also something that may be a little controversial, but I think when I look at Facebook a lot of times right now, I just it gives me hope in some ways and just makes me despair in others. Especially when I read comments that friends have about some of their other friends who I think are more like on the acquaintances kind of thing. One of the most dangerous things you can do is have bad friends. And the reason why is because they tend to have some of the most potent effect on your character. Friends are, friendship is one of the highest virtues. And part of what you do is that you are able, through your relationships, to basically feed each other's spirit. So if you have people who you are friends with, which I think is more likely the case in social media, who are feeding you bile and making you feel bad in the character of your mind, again, like watch what it does to the character of your mind. If you come out of that thinking that you feel like worse, then that's not useful. Be careful what you feed your mind, because that's what you become. So again, if you don't like the results, change the preceding conditions, and you can change habits by replacing them with other habits. You can manipulate karma by adding and eliminating conditions, trying to polarize up in the causal chain. You can train virtue, which I just mentioned with the Nicomachean ethics, and then meditation, whichever form works for you. But basically you are partially trying to train attention, the ability to pay attention, and you're trying to train the ability to kind of be aware of what's going on in your mental field. I do want to talk quickly about the magic that is love. Love is so magical for many, many reasons, but one of them is the more you give, the more you have. And so, and it has a tremendous ability to neutralize negativity. Also, forgiveness. I want to talk quickly about forgiveness. We've talked a little bit in a couple of different times about people who are dealing with abusive relationships. What forgiveness is creating a circumstance in which the suffering and the difficulty ceases to become a future cause. It has nothing to do with saying that you have to be in relationship with someone anymore. It's not about saying that what they did to you is appropriate or okay, or that you even have kind of this desire to, you don't have to reconcile with them. What you do want to do is you want to get to neutral. You want to get to the point where that is no longer causally impacting you. So a lot of times, one of the things that'll happen is people will say, I forgive you. And then realistically, the next time they're hurt, this is still there. It's still part of the ground. It's still a cause. And, so it's really about doing the work of letting go. And again, that's letting go in a way where that may be that you say, I recognize that this person is abusive and that they will never be a part of my life again. And I am working on making sure they are never a part of any lives by just being able to cut away and release and heal all the different ways in which the wounds I have sustained continue to affect me so that they no longer become causal. Okay. I also want to talk quickly the initiatory process. All initiatory traditions are essentially accelerated development, and part of what you are trying to do is to have some detachment to outcome, because what you are trying to do when you're putting causes forth in the world is to do them for the purpose of serving the work. Now, that doesn't mean that you do want to have a little bit of like looking at things to be sure that you're spending your energy kind of strategically and learning from it. But there's also a certain amount of like, you got to kind of put it out there in the world and let it go. So, and then I talked some about magic, as mentioned earlier, where what you're doing is manipulating probability by using the law of cause and effect. I mean, it's kind of like if you want to fly an airplane, you better use your understanding of the law of gravity or you're not getting anywhere. So in magic, we are using our very deep understanding that we're always trying to develop about the way in which causation works in deeply interconnected webs of being. So a couple of excellent books. I think, I don't remember if I referenced all of these, but these are just some of the ones that you may or may not know. Now, there is tons of amazing literature in Buddhism and Hinduism and Jainism, all these different Indic traditions and all the different philosophical traditions that very specifically talk about karma. And there's so many that I didn't even know how to choose or how to put priority around. I've read a lot of them. I do personally find a lot of the Buddhist understandings to be more useful and more in alignment, I think, with kind of the way in which we tend to think through magic. But Annie Besant has a couple of fabulous clear ones. Now she is working a little bit more closed system, and there is like Lords of Karma stuff, which just kind of aggravates me, but still they're very valuable. And if you can find them, they're worth reading. There's Studying Karma and then just Karma. The Kabbalion, which is originally written under the moniker of the Three Initiates, that's what kind of lays out the aphorisms of the Hermetic laws. Now, I do want to give you a few activities for practice that I'm going to recommend should you decide that you want to try to use this understanding. So activity number 1 is to create a short, pithy statement of your highest spiritual ideal or goal. And, I have one, I won't give you all of it, but it has to do with birthing the cosmopolis so that all humanity may unite in philia with all those with whom they share the greater earth and build a society that is built on the foundation of encouraging and enhancing everyone's ability to pursue aditi, excellence and virtue. Okay. So anyway, that's kind of like a quick, but having something that you can memorize, that you can like build so that you have that crystal clear thought form about what really is your spiritual ideal here. And you can look for a symbol, a sound, something that's really evocative to you for however it is that you work, that you can use to call up that ideal, make that a part of your practice, even if it's like you want something short and quick. And that way you are trying to really build into your mental field the ideals. Activity number 2, choose some way in which you want to change your character, whatever that is. And then select a couple of practices to bring about those changes. Maybe you want to be more patient. That's one that I have struggled with at various points. Okay, I want to be more patient. Choose a couple of things that you can actually integrate into your life that will be habits that you're going to form that will get you to strengthen those muscles. So maybe if you're trying to develop patience, then part of what you do is when you go to the store, you choose the longest line and you try to sit there and be patient and tell yourself, I am practicing patience, or whatever it is, something that aggravates you, and just try to create a circumstance in which you are intentionally taking that as your practice to develop patience. Activity number 3, choose an external situation that you want to alter, and then do some serious analysis looking at obstacles and identify your deficiencies, and then create a strategy to change the situation, including addressing the physical level, the feeling level, the mental level, the spiritual level. So create some sort of practice, some sort of a plan around that. So again, maybe what you find is that you have a propensity to not be able to set appropriate boundaries at work. That's a pretty common one. So do some really deep analysis about what is that? Why is that? And then figure out different ways in which you can build in some physical practices, feeling practices, mental practices, spiritual practices, whatever those things are. So part of that would be like maybe creating a statement. I mean, I've actually helped people do this, like create a statement that you have ready to pull out that you can use when you are setting boundaries, and then do something that you go back and tell yourself that you are a good person for setting those boundaries, because that's sometimes a really hard one. So, whatever it is, but try to hit those on all three of those levels. All four of those levels. So I hope that this was helpful, and I'm sure that I will do another one on some other topic here at some point. So take care.